Hands Up If You're Human podcast, dedicated to exploring and celebrating the messy reality of being human. In these conversations, we will be discussing the many challenges and barriers we all face that prevent us feeling connected, fulfilled, and happy, and explore the ways we can create the lives we really want to live by understanding, accepting, and fully embracing everything that makes us human. From our innate gifts and the things we've been taught to think of as our flaws, to our deepest unmet needs and desires that we feel shame over, we want to explore all the nuance and complexity that comes as a package deal simply by being human. Recognizing and accepting all of our true selves empowers us to authentically show up in all aspects of our lives. And now more than ever, it feels like the world needs as much acceptance and authenticity as possible. My name is Wyndham.
And I'm Lisa.
Hi, Lisa. How are you?
Yeah, all good. Getting over this lurgy, which we both have had.
Oh, God, it's tedious, isn't it?
Oh, it just stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? And just mithering. But on the positive,
mithering, that's the second time you've used that word today with me. I have no idea what it means.
Oh, really? Feeling mithered? Like feeling like,
no.
Oh, really?
No.
And you're like the wordsmith. So like that amazing.
Every day's a school day.
Yeah, just feeling like full and like, I can't think of another word for mithered. Agitated.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's all
right. I just very briefly want to mention we've run into a small copyright issue with our theme tune, which is why it's not on the front of this episode. We are working to find an equally catchy and appropriate theme tune moving forward, but yes, that's why it's a bit different. Damn copywriters.
I know, but it started off not being that it's not like we didn't know that it was, we found something that we could use and now we can't use it. So.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, we haven't blindly gone into this bit as well as
as well as the name.
As well as the name. Yeah. Anyway. Okay, so today, what are we talking about today, Lisa? Because this is one that you have proposed.
Yeah, so we're going to discuss like a really delicate subject, which is grief. And that's really come about because over the last month particularly, I've had many conversations with people, students and friends that have experienced grief recently or are going through another kind of phase. That sounds like I'm making it. I think because grief is so unpredictable, sometimes, you think 2 years along the line that you won't be feeling certain things. And actually some people are coming to me going, I wasn't expecting to have another feeling of depth of grief again. So it's been very much in my perimeter of, and I just felt like we do not talk about it enough. We don't talk about death, and I understand why. But from my own personal experience of, of grief in the last couple of years myself, is it would be really helpful if someone had had a conversation with me about certain things about it.
Yeah.
And I guess it's, something that I'd therefore like for us to kind of go through and share.
Well, it's something that everybody is going to go through more than once. So I agree. We don't talk about it. And actually, when you're saying we will come to the fact that it isn't just death that is a trigger for grief. But when you said I understand why we don't talk about death. It's do we it's because we're afraid of it, right? I think.
Yeah.
But that doesn't feel like a very good reason because it is guaranteed for all of us.
Yeah.
So it brings us to, I talk a lot, full stop. No, I talk a lot about we can't address what we aren't aware of. And I think when the word grief is used, it conjures this idea for me, or this sense of like a big wave or a big cloud that's coming over and is going to smother me. So I just wanted to I'm all about stripping away the story and dealing with what is, rather than all of the added nuance and layers and fears and all that kind of stuff that we tend to put on things. So for me, when we look at grief, what is grief? What are we actually dealing with? Well, grief is an emotional reaction to our relationship with loss or regret. So when we're kind of looking to deal with it, it's our emotions. That's what we're dealing with, a massive uprising of emotion. And I think in part that's why we struggle so much with it, because we've said on previous episodes, none of us get any training in our emotions. And as human beings, that's fundamentally, we are blessed with this vast array of physically embodied feeling about our lived experience, but we have no training as to what the fuck to do with
it. You're so right.
Yeah. So just as a kickoff, it's like, let's just accept that's what we're dealing with when we talk about grief. It's an emotional reaction. It's our body giving us information, and it is triggered by our relationship to what we perceive as a loss or a regret.
Really, really well put.
Thank you.
Yeah, no. Yeah, and with that, you know, the obvious place we go to when we say grief is death.
Yeah.
Yet, as we will discuss through this podcast, and you've also said there, is it can be a loss of a relationship, a loss of a life that you thought you were going to have, a loss of a job that you loved, you'd be made redundant, divorced, like that's still a grief. It's still a grieving process. And again, I think we're crap at humans of acknowledging that and forcing ourselves to try and feel better very quickly, when it is okay to feel really, really like all the emotions that come from any of those losses.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a big subject. And I think what we also realized when we've had a conversation about it before is that it's so big that we could easily go off on tangent on this podcast, and we're going to try our best not to. And we also realize it's a delicate subject, so we will do our best to be mindful of that. Also, we're not professionals in this. We are literally giving our experiences, our own experiences, and our own observations of it.
Yeah. And actually, I think there's one of the things that comes from, you know, how we'll get there towards the end. What do you do? How do you deal with grief? Right up front, speaking to somebody who is trained in this stuff, it's probably not a bad idea.
Definitely.
However, so with that, all of that in mind, do we want to start with the big obvious one and then come to the others later?
I feel so. I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. So therefore, putting you in the spotlight for a moment, I'm absolutely happy to share my experience as well. You said earlier that it's relatively recent, the last couple of years for you, you've had 2 immediate family members die. And I remember as you went through that, and certainly the conversations we've had since, one of the frustrations I think you had was your grief didn't manifest the way you thought it would, or you didn't deal with it as well as you thought you would have been set up to deal with it.
Yeah. So for those who are new to listen to this podcast, this is the first one. I lost my brother and my mum 3 months apart from each other 2 years ago. Both very different experiences. Craig's eventually was a sudden, unexpected death, although he'd been poorly for a good couple of years beforehand. And mum we knew that she was coming to end of life, and we did end of life at home. So I have one where I wake up in the morning and I get a phone call to say he's gone, which was like that memory is going to be stuck in my head forever. You know, that's never going to go, because I saw him the day before and he was fine, and I'd put it on social media that he'd come home to see us at home, and so it really actually threw me completely. And then with mum, it was great. We get the opportunity to have a gentle, as they were saying, a cushioning down, like very gently end of life. And it was actually horrific. And anyone that's done end of life will probably feel the same. Like I know there's no same story, the same, but it's not a pleasant thing, I try to be as mindful. I think someone called me a doula. Doulas are normally seen as people that help people bring their babies into the world that aren't midwives, but also they talk about doulas being the opposite of helping someone transition out of life.
Right. Okay.
So I thought, oh yeah, I saw it as a privilege, but actually it was, but oh my goodness, it was 11 days of absolute, I felt like torture for everybody, really, or those who cared for her, and most importantly for mum, who was trying to transition out of this, so I thought I was pretty, philosophical about, I believe there's a soul and it continues and everything's eternal, but
because you have these, that's pre-developed, right? You had that, or rather you have that belief and philosophy that precedes this 3-month span 2 years ago. You didn't come to that as a result of those experiences.
No.
You took that belief into those experiences.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But it's very different when it actually happens, because it is the physical person that is no longer there, and your life changes. I mean, it instantly changes from that point onwards, doesn't it? I think I got frustrated with the fact that people said that there was 5 or 7 stages of grief. Don't believe in that for 1 second.
I think this is this the Kubler-Ross? I think it's a change curve. This is where you kind of, I can't remember the order, but it's denial, it's anger, it's shock, it's negotiation, and then finally acceptance.
Yeah. And that's not how it rolls at all.
No. It's interesting. I did look at, I saw it recently, and actually the original Kubler-Ross change curve is 5 stages. And I think as all of these things kind of drop into people's subconscious and they think, oh, that's how it is, but it's been updated because the lived experience is way more complicated than a simple 5-step process. And it goes backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and up and down. And who knows when you arrive at that acceptance piece.
Exactly. And that's exactly it. It's I think any healing that we have to go through isn't linear or that obvious, and it depends on who you are and what you've just experienced. I think,
and you've used linear there. Was that your expectation?
No, but I didn't. I guess over the last 2 years, the unpredictability of it, like feeling like, oh, so originally, and I don't know if listeners will have experienced the same, is first of all, it's the shock that they've actually then gone. There is a relief for me. There was definitely relief when mum had passed, especially, and Craig, really, that they were no longer suffering. But then there is, and then people then are around you, so you're kind of looked after. And I think you talked about it once before, that you kind of like, everyone's not expecting you to be okay. So you're kind of like able to heal because there's no expectations on you, because of course there wouldn't be. And then there is this, then life goes on. And yet the process of grief continues, because for one, you're processing, well, I was processing the shock of what I'd seen that come before that. The horrific scenes that at one point, the counselor that I saw, psychiatrist I saw, was like worried I got post-traumatic stress, which it wasn't, because I was going to bed and I had images in my head of certain things that happened. Actually, it was literally, I think, myself just processing it, but I understand how people can it's different. It's like I was aware that I was having the thoughts rather than I felt like I was back in that scenario. And then what comes from it is you start to go back onto your life and what impact they've had on you. And for me, it was also moments of realization that we had lived a very different life, and not to go down the rabbit hole of what if they were not this ill.
It's a really important point, I think, because my dad died approaching 3 years ago, and in the aftermath, it was unexpected. It was kind of over 5 days. It was like, shit. And in the aftermath, you can't help but reflect. And, how did you leave that relationship? What was the last thing you said to that person? What was the last argument you had? What did you say that wasn't very nice to them? We're filled with what we didn't do, or what we wish we had the opportunity to change. And we can't. We know we can't. And so it's such an important part of grief to recognize, one, that we can't change it, and two, that everything we do makes sense in the moment.
Yeah.
And we may not understand why it makes sense, but it does to some degree. And if we reflect and kind of go, oh, I was awful to that person. Number one, there's a reason for that. That behavior makes sense on some level, but it's also an opportunity to learn moving forward and give compassion to ourselves and to other people, and kind of strip away the stories and kind of go, well, actually, can I just be in this? Can I offer this person love, even in the face of them winding me up, where my natural reaction might be different? It's so easy to get caught on the regret of something in the past that we absolutely can't change.
Yeah. And it's absolutely, and that was something. So you asked me yesterday, like, what support did you have, or how did you get through the depths of grief? And luckily, both my dad and I were offered a grief counsellor who was a psychiatrist at Rowan's Hospice. Not that we used Rowan's Hospice; we did it at home, and we didn't have them in. And we both like, yep, we'll definitely do it, because it was new. I knew it was coming. I knew it was a life lesson that I was destined to have. My whole life had been kind of geared up to this, 2 siblings with degenerative conditions, life limiting, spent some of my holidays, school holidays, at least once a year in children's hospice. So I was around death all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I knew I hadn't really experienced it yet, and it was coming. And it was of no surprise to me that they died 3 months apart from each other, because in some ways, it was a blessing, because we weren't out of the grief in the first place, and we were then continued. Craig had died, Mum was really poorly and was very obviously near the end anyway. So it just continued on. So actually, although it was a huge loss, it was also it wasn't like a year later then we were doing it again, if that makes sense, because we knew it was coming. So this grief, so having this counselor was amazing to a certain point, because she made that normalized. Like, I could only remember the time that I wasn't fully present for Craig in the hospital, where he ended up having a terrible episode. And lucky my dad we were overlapping, so my dad was in, and then he was then calling the relevant people, the specialists, to come and support him. But I had that in my head that this one time I let him down. And actually, the morning my mum passed, like, we were knackered, right? We were like, there was 3 of us, my dad, my mum's main carer, me, literally doing 3-hour stints trying to get us, like, we're like bed hopping, just delirious states that you get into at near end of life. And all I can remember was the morning that she passed I was so tired that I woke up, went to the loo, and went back to bed again. And actually, I got there just as she took her last breath, but I was like, I could have had those 10 minutes longer with her. But I've been there the whole 11 days. So it's like, oh my God, she could have passed at any of those points. And it was like, but feeling guilty that I'd gone back to have a bit more of a nap because I was that tired.
Yeah.
And
that's excuse me, I think really important as well is that, knowing you the way I do, and the conversations we've had with both of those instances, with your brother and your mum, going into that, you would know, like, intellectually know, that you can't be there all the time. That of course there are going to be things you reflect on and go, oh, could have been there, but that as a complete human being, you've got all these other things going on, which you can't just move everything else aside. There is everybody's life to be dealt with. And it's the difference between knowing and when the event happens, embodying that knowledge. So even though you know it, you still have this uprising of guilt, because deep down, there's the connection isn't quite there, or the grief is so big that this emotion's going to have to come out. You're going to have to feel the guilt, because it's part of the spectrum of emotion that we get with grief. And then we need to sit with it. I use the word need, but then we process it by sitting with it and having this conversation with it that says, I get it. I understand why I feel this way. What could I have done? Nothing really, because I didn't do it. Therefore, living in the past isn't helpful.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, again, because both of them were so poorly for the last 2 years, we were in and out of hospital quite a lot, but both didn't communicate anymore, really, you know, that it was exhausting, because you are basically the spokesperson. You're like not they, you know, you want to be there for them so they're not alone, but at the same time you're like having a conversation and that there's nothing coming back. So I think there were times that, you know, again, as I'm just having memories as we're talking about this, like, again, I remember fighting Craig's corner at hospital, and like we'd had another failed discharge, and we were back in again, and like the system's broken, like in the hospitals. And I don't care what anyone says, the NHS are doing brilliantly with what they've got, but when you have got people that you care about in those wards and they are not being taken care of, or like you said, they have a failed discharge and they're back in again because of an error they've made, not because of the person that's poorly, you're doing all of that as well. So that's energetically, you're emotionally absolutely depleted. And then you've got to go, you know, well, we've been and done this today. You start, you know, you're trying to normalize what's not normal, like, and that is exhausting. But realizing you can only do that for a certain amount of time, and actually to protect yourself, you then have to walk away. But then the guilt of, oh, I've left them in the ward, and I could have done another half an hour. I could have done another hour. Actually, I couldn't. You couldn't. But the guilt and they were the unexpected parts of grief I just didn't see coming. At all. And then the other things were, you're then, you know, I have a family, so I've been away from my family for 11 days pretty much. I've been back for a couple of hours. You know, got a little Jude, like, we're going camping tomorrow. You're like, oh. And then your guilt of that, going, oh my God, we are going camping tomorrow. And you want to continue through with that. And you're thinking, well, we're going to go camping tomorrow. I haven't slept for 11 days, but it's okay. But you're in such a delirious state by then that actually, you know, why not have another couple of nights in a campsite where you can't sleep and actually be away from the situation for a short period of time? And then the other part of that was, for me, in my household, not everyone else was grieving at all on the same level as I was. Which is a blessing, because therefore you're not holding space for other people's emotions, but also they're getting on with their lives, and you're trying to normalize again something that is totally new and discombobulating and painful, and it's a big thing.
So help contextualize that for people. Why do you think there was a difference in the grief felt?
So for one, I have stepchildren, so they didn't know my mum prior to her MS severely taking her over, and knowing my mum as a vibrant woman, they'd always seen her as unwell. They've never communicated with her, so there's no relationship there for them to grieve. Also, you're young, right? So we've discussed this before, that my nan died when I was probably 14, 15, and it was horrible because she was pretty much another mother figure to me. However, I reflect back on that and I moved through that quite quickly. Where this is very, very different. You know, for one, the reason I'm here is because of my mum. Do you know what I mean? So like, that's again like a bit of a minefield. And then another reason was I've been grieving my mum for years.
Yeah. So I want to come on to that. Can I pin that just,
You can, because I realised.
So with regard to what you've just said about your stepchildren, and the age of people, I think it's really important to recognize that nobody is having the same grief experience. Even if, I've got 4 siblings, none of us, when our dad died, are having the same experience.
No.
We're not, because we all had different relationships with our dad. We all loved him, and we all had different relationships. So the level of despair or sadness or guilt or joyful, whatever it is, that we all did different things with him and had a different relationship with him. So even the people like no degrees of separation, and my mum, completely different relationship, but even the people with the same degree of separation are having a different experience. As soon as you go 1 degree further removed, so my brother has 2 kids. Did they grieve? Yeah, of course they did. But it's a different kind of grief, because it's not the same proximity of relationship. And they didn't know him as long. Like he died, I was 45. He and my mum had been married since I was 6. It's like 40 years. It'd been the whole of my step brother and sister's lives. And so you have this, of course it's more, of course it impacts greater because of that proximity and because of the duration of the relationship. I think it's, and I think it's really important also to recognize that because there's that degree of separation, it's hard for those people to maintain that level of, this is going to be awful for you for a long time. Especially if they haven't been through it yet.
Yeah.
And that whole kind of finding people who have empathy through experience, I think is really important. My mum mentioned it, that she has some friends who've been through it before she has. And they're the ones who are there at the beginning of the 2nd year, where they've done all of those experiences, where you've had to live all of those experiences for the first time again, birthdays, Christmas, holidays, whatever they might be, renewal of insurance, mundane things. You've had to do that once in a new way because the person has died. And everybody's there for the first year. They're going, oh my God, it's awful. But then everybody, through degrees of separation from the moment, their lives carry on. And having people who can go, I know what this year is going to be like for you. I'm here for you. You can speak to me, I think is really important. But recognizing you're not going to get that from everybody.
No. And even your partner, because they of course they're not going to feel it like you do. Yeah. And it's not that, and I think that's what comes. I remember someone saying to me, their mama passed just a little earlier than Craig, and she said, what I've noticed is there's certain people I can talk to about this, and there's certain people I can't, and the people I can talk to are those who have been there and have been on a similar journey. And it's true, and I'd like to think that if the time comes that, say, my husband experiences such loss as well, is that I would have that deeper understanding of, oh yeah, like it's, there's so much more to it than let's get through that they've passed, let's sort the funeral out. And again, another bit that no one talks about the weird things you're then going to experience when you have to arrange a funeral for somebody.
You have to be in event mode at the point you've got all this emotion crashing around inside you.
And asking really stupid questions, like not stupid, totally understandable. Oh, Craig had a metal rod in his back. It has severe spine surgery and hip replacement and stuff. Would you like his metal? What? Oof. I mean, you've literally just lost him. We're at a funeral, parlor or whatever. We're speaking to this young girl who looks about 16. would we like his metal when he's cremated? What? Like, I mean, we're still like in like delirious mode. Like, is that really a question? Well, no, it is. It's absolutely a question.
Yeah.
What would you like them to wear? What would you like them to wear? Like, what do you mean? Like, and again, no one, they're really, again, now I know when people are going through, I'm thinking, oh my God, you've got all of that to come. You've got to arrange an event, like you said, which is meant to be a celebration, but you want it to be, but of course it can't be a celebration as we would see it normally. And then you've got to go and pick them up in a urn. And I think the biggest shock for me was it was a reference number, and you go and pick up this
Argos. Okay, would number 67 go to collection point D?
Totally. And they have got the people give it to you, that's their job. So they're not, oh, you poor thing. So then you're like, sat in the car, like dad's driving, and you've got your brother on his lap in ashes. I mean, it's so surreal that you cannot but see life and death in a different way after experience such grief. But one thing that worries me sometimes when I'm observing friends that have recently experienced grief is going into doing mode still, even afterwards. I think there's a natural curve of that anyway, because you're used to it, especially if you've been supporting someone for many years because they've been poorly for whatever, for all sorts of different reasons. But then the distractions that we can then add on to that, which are not healthy or supportive for the grieving process.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad you added for the grieving process to that, because they might not be healthy and supportive for the grieving process. They might be what people need to do.
Yes,
and I kind of reflect back to the very beginning where we discussed, well, what is it? It's an emotional reaction to our relationship with a loss or a regret, and we're not trained in our emotions, and it is the biggest emotional bomb detonating, and they're not the emotions that we've been allowed to show. They're not oh, I'm joyful. It's like, I'm distraught, I'm deeply vulnerable, I'm unbelievably sad, I'm full of regret, feeling guilty, and I'm feeling shame at how I treated whatever it might be. So we have this perfect storm of our bodies and soul feeling this experience because we've lost something or someone, and we have no skills. Absolutely no skills. And so in my mind, it is no wonder that so many people look to avoid those feelings, because they're terrifying, and they avoid them through being super busy, immediately going back into work. I'm going, no, I'm fine, don't worry. Or masking them with other substances and agents. And on the one hand, I completely understand that. And like you say, it doesn't help the process. And I think the one thing I would guarantee with grief is, at some point, it's going to come and get you. You can't fight it forever. And when it imposes itself, you have no choice when that is. And I think many people will recognize those kind of breakdown moments when you're driving a car, or you're on the tube, or it's never in an appropriate place, because we've pushed it away and pushed it away and pushed it away. If we can find the courage to face it, we can maybe address it in an environment that is appropriate, or a space that is appropriate, or at a time. But it doesn't surprise me in the slightest people avoid it. We have no training in it.
And yet they avoid it, but then it would show up like illness in themselves. Because it's interesting, because I'm a lot of the work that I do with the yoga therapy is linked to Chinese medicine. So they say Chinese medicine is that grief is held in the lungs. Now, I think grief can be held in any part of the body. And I think depending what your weakness is in your body, you're more like, it's going to attack you in some way. But it's an interesting one, because the lungs also is, your heart center, like it's to do with the heart chakra in yoga philosophy. And like, of course, you've got a broken heart, you know, or a grieving heart, even if it's that your relationship wasn't a loving relationship, or it's the other emotions that have come because of your regret or you're angry towards them. You know, I still, my mum, I was like, you know, it's taken me a real long time to kind of find compassion again for her, because I felt really cross with her for so many reasons. For one, how the death was so long and it was painful and we all had to observe such a horrible thing. But, you know, all the other things that then came from it as well. But actually then once I had to go through that to go, oh, but there was this beautiful woman that brought me into the world and actually did the bloody best she could. But my heart for her, my heart center wasn't open. I was like closed off. And if I wasn't careful, the first thing I wanted to do was smoke, which is really interesting. Because of course I did. I wanted to fill the lungs up with like, then I don't have to feel, then I don't have to, you know, it's an old habit I used to have, but it was one of the first things I wanted to do, because it meant then I didn't have to actually really feel any of those things. And actually, yeah, it was a really interesting, again, unexpected want, if that makes sense. So, you know, and then all the other thing is overwhelm. You know, I felt overwhelmed very quickly about lots of things. So for example, like, I don't know, something like a venue I was using for yoga classes cancelled on me. Well, it was like the end of the world, because my pot was so full that I couldn't let the valve off enough to then be able to cope. So although you think you're not dealing with grief, or you're not, you know, it's not impacting you because you're not bawling your eyes out or in an emotional state on the floor or saying no to work or no to commitments, is actually agitated with my husband, created friction in the house, you know, because it was there. It was there. It just wasn't labeled as grief, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it goes back to what you were saying earlier, that life is still going on. So whatever your daily level of, like, if you think of that kind of pot that you're talking about is full of demand and rest or not. And as you rest, then you can let the levels drop a little bit, and there's a more natural processing of the daily stress. Like I said, you've got this this huge bomb has gone off and filled all of your capacity to deal with anything.
Yeah.
And then the day-to-day stuff is still going on. So it is the little things that you can't deal with.
Yeah.
You just can't. And then if we then kind of tie that back into the degrees of separation, you've then got this group of people in your life going, what is going on?
Yeah.
I mean, I know she's sad or he's sad. I get it, but all I did was not put my cup in the dishwasher. And it's like, okay, that's because those are the things I can't deal with. I don't have capacity for them, because all of my being is dealing with this.
Yeah. And then there's another process then the following year. So again, I know two examples of this. I've got somebody who's come into my life recently who I can see they've lost their mum, and she's got lots of children, and her mum would have been a hands-on helper, and she hasn't got that right now. She hasn't got that person that was the support for her as well. For me, it was the other way around. We supported mum and Craig a lot. I mean, Craig was in a home, but ultimately we're advocating. But mum, everything revolved around mum, which meant that then there was this massive void for my dad mainly, but me as well. And then I'm like, I don't know how to fill it, and I'm then expecting my husband to find the way of filling it with me. Like, why are you not spending time with me? Oh, because we didn't used to have this time. Like, you know, I'm like, you know, like, why? Of course he's not on the same page, because we haven't been able to live like that, because your weekends on a Saturday, or if you had to cover the yoga and cover the caring, you were there. Holidays, I was there to cover the carer. So all of a sudden you've got all this space, and then I'm expecting everybody to know that I need now you to come in and help me fill it.
It's those. It's a really good point. We've been speaking at our relationship to the people we've lost. So, but it's very different for your dad and my mum, there's these life partners where everything is done in conjunction with somebody else, even if they're not physically taking part in the activity. You go off and do something separately, but there's still this pattern of behavior and this negotiation and this support structure that, holy crap, that's like, when that goes, you're a reed in the wind, and it's like, how do you cope with that? I've not been through that, so I can just imagine by degree of magnitude more how painful that is and how difficult that is.
And I think there's a contrast between our parents, because your dad was well, so they did do things together, where dad's has literally been on his own, but with somebody there, physically there, but not able to do things so together. So again, another part of the grief that I wasn't expecting was it gave me and dad more time. It gave him time to then also be with his grandson that he hasn't been able to for the last 3 years, and build a relationship there. So he can come over, like last night, the football was on, great. So I do dinner and everyone sat there watching the football. Could never happen before. I used to get quite frustrated, like I went to come for a roast dinner, can't. Every Christmas Day never happened here. We couldn't have them here because mum was so poorly for so many years. So then we took him on holiday, and I had this, wonderful. I took him on holiday, but the sadness that came from the fact that I realized that he was like in awe of like the most simplest things, like me getting him a cup of coffee on the way back from the gym, or just doing what partners do for each other, like, because we shared a room, and he's, oh, you make such a good wife. I'm like, well, no, this is just like, this to me is, and I'm saying it like in the most like normal, it is normality. And that was so sad, because I was thinking, oh, and then I again being careful not to go down the rabbit hole, going, oh my goodness, what you have missed out on.
It's interesting. So you've covered two things there, which I think are really important. One is I'm trying to choose my words carefully, but the opportunities afforded you and particularly your dad now, and then instantly almost this kind of guilt and these other emotions about, oh my God, it regret that this is a life you haven't lived till now. And you have this kind of, so I wrote down silver linings earlier in something you'd said, and I didn't write down what it was about, which is annoying. But that whole, I think grief is such an all-consuming thing at times, that we want it to go away. So we hide it, we mask it, we do those things. And actually, like you said, there's a physical risk in suppressing those emotions. It will impact your body, and that will obviously impact your life. And I think it's having that, more than two things can be true at the same time, right? So I can be deeply sad and in grief, and at the same time be grateful for it. And had somebody told me that a few years ago, I would have told them to get on their bike and do one. So I just want to be clear about what I mean. We spoke about degrees of separation. The only reason I feel the grief I feel is because of the love that preceded it. In the instance with me and my dad, I know we'll come on to those shortly, the other kinds of grief and loss, but in this instance, the love I felt for him, well, this is the price I pay for it. And that kind of feeling of loss and feeling of sadness, I willingly accept, because it doesn't exist without the love that preceded it. And I kind of look at, the balance, cosmic balance, the universe, all those things, there's a price for everything. And in this instance, it's one I pay willingly. It hurts and it's awful. And at the same time, I can find my silver lining by saying, yeah, but this doesn't exist without what came before it. So, okay, if this is the price, fine, I pay the price.
And it's interesting you say, yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with that. And and actually, it's interesting how much then comes up on your social media pages on grief when you're going through it, and the quotes which seem like a quote when you're not experiencing it become so much more deep and meaningful, because like, oh yeah, it is that. But I guess, like you saying, having two feelings at the same time, I really genuinely am now. It's 2 years, literally last Monday, a week today, where I am now more grateful than ever that I get the time with my dad and the one-to-one with him, and to go, he's in awe of life now. You know what I mean? He's in awe of all these things. He's very, luckily he's, again, we've talked about before, a very wise soul and very deep soul. So he hasn't sat and not made a new way of being for himself. He has gone out by the, right, I'm going off to India, and that doesn't mean that he's not feeling sad and the loss. It just means he is going, okay, I'm accepting of what is. I've got two ways I could go with this, or maybe more than two ways, and I'm choosing, I'm going to go and experience things I've not been able to do yet.
Yeah, amazing. I kind of, sorry, go on.
No, and that's fine. Go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to. So we've sort of dealt with the big front and center of what people typically think of when we talk about grief, or we've discussed it. I'm not saying we've dealt with it. Yeah, boxed it up. We're all done. But I think it's really important to consider the if grief is an emotional reaction to loss or regret, then it isn't just associated with the death of people or pets or whatever it might be. Earlier, we put a pin in, there've been grief for years. So I'd quite like to kind of explore that just a little bit. I don't want us to run too long. But yeah, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So for one, like we said, all three, Mum, Craig and Becky, have had this kind of cloud over them of a life-limiting disease or condition. So there was always what we call living grief, and people I've spoken to know exactly what I'm talking about when I say living grief, because it's grief of what could have been if there wasn't those conditions happening. So things like when I had my son, for example, I grieved then the fact that my mum didn't really know what was going on, and I had to go to her the day after giving birth to show her grandson, rather than my mum would have definitely been at the house. She'd have put the heating on, got me a cup of tea, nurtured me. Didn't have any of that, just didn't. And and that was a grief. It was over many years, it was like coming to terms with, oh right, now they're not communicating verbally, we're now having to communicate in a different way. Or, oh, no longer they can't walk anymore. So you're constantly in this kind of catch up time of like, and then it's amazing how quickly you accept that you've lost that bit. Oh, we can't go out as a family anymore because mum can't last any longer than an hour and a half out shopping, where only 3 months before we'd be meeting up and we'd be having a coffee. She might not be communicating, but she was enjoying herself and smiling, and then all of a sudden it becomes so. I mean, my whole life, or our whole life as a family, has been this constant like loss, really.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it it kind of talks to two things. I think one is an ongoing relationship with kind of degrees of grief. So at one point you had to accept that your mum became non-verbal. That's a loss, so there's a grief there. And then maybe non-ambulatory and couldn't walk, and so these are incremental increases in grief. But there's also a lived grief about what never was. So it's not just the actual loss of something, it's the loss of something that could have been.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting is I think we're at a time now where more and more people later in life, so 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, are receiving things like diagnoses of neurodiversity, and that they're suddenly having this moment of like, oh my God, I've spent the whole of my life thinking there's something wrong with me. Like thinking I'm mental, or I've spent the whole of my life being in situations I couldn't understand why I was so unhappy and uncomfortable. Well, I now know I've got this diagnosis. That's why. And there's a loss of what might have been had that diagnosis come sooner in life. And it's the same emotional feeling. It is a grief.
Absolutely. And I think from our personal experience, and I'll be talking on my dad's behalf, is you've got to be really careful. You can go down the rabbit hole and you could not get out if you continued about what if. It's like mum's diagnosis was quite late, but she had signed for a long time. Again, would that have impacted them differently? Would they have gone, fuck it, we're going and doing this or doing that, if they'd known that actually this is a degenerative condition as well, and you're going to possibly die at a younger age? Maybe. I've had my best friend's, her cousins just died of motor neuron very quickly, and they diagnosed it quite it's the most progressive, so it was over a very short period of time, but they've been going back and forth to the neurologist, and then it's like, oh, that window of time, if they'd known another year before that, what would they have done in that year? But you're right, in terms of being given a diagnosis of anything, and then understanding why you haven't been able to live a life that looks like everyone else is living, then that brings up all the resentment, anger, what if. And actually, maybe it comes down to what you said in our last podcast, is that we can do that and go, I wish I'd learned this 20 years ago because of the life I would have lived. But actually, is it that we are meant to find out, or at that exact right time, for whatever reason?
And it's interesting because it is that regret is, it's never. So I think regret is an inability to accept what is. So we look back and we wish it were different, or we look back on a decision we've made and wish we'd made a different one. Well, we didn't. And all of the decisions we've ever made sense on some level at the time. And so that when we get to that place in grief, and we look back and it's with regret, it's okay, what I think the approach we benefit from is going, I recognize it for what it is, because it's going to happen. You're going to feel regret. But what am I regretful of? I'm regretful that this didn't happen. Okay, I fully accept that and recognize that. It's massive. What can you do about it? I can't actually do anything about it retrospectively. But from this point forward, what can you do? Well, I can, like your dad is doing, I can embrace my life. I can take what I've learned and I can look forward and I can say, all right, no more. This has got me to where I am. I'm now this older, wiser human being. I'm going to move forward unapologetic in what I do and how I show up as myself.
And it's interesting, because as you're saying that, it's like we've been given an opportunity to put that into place or try it again because of Becky, and say that try it again in terms of, she has the same condition, she's deteriorating, we're grieving her at the moment because she's gone through another deterioration. And she used to drive me potty because she'd phone me 20 times a day, and I'll be in the middle of something and you say, right, I'm just about to teach, I'm about to this, and the phone would ring. Now she's stopped phoning us as much because I just don't think her capacity to do it. So you're then living in this, like, it's conflict, because you're like, oh, I'm so pleased you're not phoning me so much, but oh, I know you're not phoning me so much because you're actually not as able to do that anymore. And so I feel like it's a really interesting one, because again, spending time with someone, I think a lot of people go, I wish I'd spent more time with that person before they died. I wish I'd given them that little bit of extra, which I didn't go to see them because I put myself first, or I went off to a party rather than whatever it is. I feel like we're being given that opportunity to go, try not to live with any regrets. However, I think that it will naturally always be part of it.
Yeah. And I think what you just said, try not to live without regret, is the right approach. Is I'm going to try as hard as I can. And when that regret comes up, I'm not going to allow, I'm going to be aware that there'll be layers of story I apply to it, which magnify the regret and generate guilt or shame.
I think it's, sorry, I'm going to just interrupt you there. Just in terms of widening that grief to, say, like an end of a relationship, I think that is when a relationship's ended for me. That's the first thing that I remember coming in each time was, oh my goodness, if only I'd done that, if only I'd done that. It's my fault that they split up with me, or I split up, like I could have put up with that. Like we could have had a better conversation about it. It really genuinely is just like a stage of it. It's of any of the grief. A job, you get made redundant. Oh, they got rid of me because I've been a bit slack the last 6 months, or whatever. You'll find your reasoning. But you're right. As long as you have that, you've done your best, and as you always say, doing your best at that time with what you have, and the wisdom and the knowledge you have, then that is good enough.
Yeah, I agree. And it is having a process where you reflect and learn from the situations you're in, is that you take more into the next one. And you're going to feel grief at the next time as well. And you're going to feel guilt and regret and all those things again, because that's the nature of being a human being. But to have the pause, the ability to recognize what is happening, rather than buy into the story we tell ourselves about what is happening, and just accept that we're all human, and that this is all real, this is all part of it, and actually we are not our emotions, we are experiencing our emotions, and this too shall pass.
So I want to ask you then, so how would you, therefore, if someone came to you, how would they be able to get to that place of processing? What would anchor them to, or do you know what I mean? What would you suggest?
So for me, it's an interesting one, because there's a process to go through to get to where I am and where you are, and there's years of reflection. The single most important thing, I think, is recognizing that everything you are feeling is entirely normal. Entirely normal. And once we've recognized that it's entirely normal, also recognizing if I don't feel it, I'm going to suppress it, and it's going to get me at some point, and it will have, as you were talking about, the impact on the body. And it is, one, it's entirely normal, and two, it's simply messages from our body. So the two things I think that really helped me were, one, finding my silver lining and recognizing that I can feel two things at the same time. I can feel all the grief, and I can feel a sense of joy that I get to feel the grief. As obscure and obtuse as that might sound, I don't feel the grief without the love, if we're talking about loss of a person. If we're talking about loss of what might have been, then it's all of the emotions are entirely normal. Allow them, feel them, and then what do you want to do now? What's next? Because we only get one go at this life as us. And, you might want to talk about the afterlife and what happens after. We only get one go at this. I only get however many years duration I get as Wyndham. What do I want that to be? Because I definitely don't want to sit in regret. I've done that for too long. I've looked back and, like you said, I wish I'd had this revelation 20 years ago. I didn't. So if I sit with that regret, I extend the period in which I'm not being who I am, really. So it would be feel it, it's all normal. Be grateful for it because there's a lesson in it. Whatever is causing it, there is a lesson in it. What's the lesson? What do I do next? What about you?
Yeah, I echo what you've just said. I do feel that for me, having a therapist was a good, like I'd say, an anchor to get to that point of everything I'm feeling and the way I'm behaving is totally and utterly normal.
Yeah.
I would say don't try and suppress those feelings with things like alcohol, drugs, things that are going to might be a short term kind of like, oh, I feel a bit of a relief and a space away from it. I just think it comes back 10 times harder. Not that I massively did that, but I did notice that any social event would turn into me being very emotional the next day.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, it wasn't helpful. And I guess it's accepting other people's response to that. That was what I struggled with the most. I genuinely thought people were going to understand more than they understood, who were like friends and family, except for my dad. It was a lot easier with dad, obviously, but and that was finding acceptance and compassion towards that too, going, well, they haven't experienced that yet, so they would not know how to support you through this right now.
Yeah. And there's also that point of how are we communicating what we're going through?
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Because we're not, probably.
No, it's coming out all messed up and wrong way around.
Because you were talking about the container that's overflowing. We don't have the capacity at that point to be able to step back and go, can I just articulate to you clearly and succinctly with as little emotion as possible what I'm going through? Because an emotional bomb has just gone off. Of course, we're not going to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So I agree that compassion and finding people and time to communicate where we can, where we feel safe to do so, because everything is better when we share it with the right people.
And I'd like to add on to that, like, oh, and then eat healthy and make sure you get on your yoga mat. And however, it is the hardest thing to really put as, even though we know that is going to help us, it's actually really then becomes a challenge rather than at that point feel like a support, because you want the easiest things to make you feel comforted.
And equally, so when having practiced yoga increasingly for 6 or 7 years, and by the end, at least 6 days a week, every day, I've practiced twice since my dad died. I taught for about a year, but I didn't practice. And I still haven't.
And I think if I wasn't a teacher, that would be the same. And again, I feel that that's anchored me.
Yeah.
It anchored me when I'd given birth, because I had to get back on the mat a few weeks later because I had a studio and cover just didn't happen. Felt like it anchored me into my beliefs and my truly what I believe in life and death.
And a previous life before the deaths. This was a habit of pattern of behavior.
Yeah. And then the same is, you know, the philosophy of yoga. And I quite often leave a thought for people in Shavasana and what Shavasana means. Shavasana is the very final pose of yoga, and it's actually named corpse pose. That's what it translates to. And it's like, I had that constant reminder of, this is our physical body. We are borrowing it for this lifetime as Lisa. That doesn't stay around. But I believe the essence or the soul within us is eternal. So because I kept on going back on the mat and I kept on teaching, it became even more profound and ingrained and deeper belief than I've ever had with that, because I've experienced literally life leaving the body.
Yeah. It's a fascinating one, because I think those kind of known patterns, the behaviors that we had pre-grief, can be helpful. Not everybody has the kind of pattern of behavior and practice that actually at its core is going to ingrain and be a place of peace and a move towards a deeper understanding. So it's being mindful of what that behavior is that we're doing. For some, you mentioned it will be going out and drinking too much, and it's a very short term. It's not even a fix. It's a short term avoider.
But people are very accepting of that. People
Yeah,
are very accepting of course they're going to behave like that because they've just lost,
go out and get leathered.
Yeah,
like, it isn't going to help.
No, absolutely not. But then to do the flip side of that and be, okay, well, I'm going to make sure I look after myself and whatever is a big push.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm just very lucky that it's part of what I do daily.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm kind of not forced on me because I've chosen to do it, but it means that I, like I said, got back, I think, quicker or more acceptance, maybe quicker than I definitely would have done than 20 years ago.
Yeah. We use the tools we have, right?
Absolutely.
And if the only tool I have is to mask how I feel with alcohol, for example, that's what I'm going to do, because we don't have the training in dealing with being a human being. And I guess I am a bit more conscious of time, but I guess it's that, for me anyway, it is everybody who experiences loss will experience grief. Everybody.
Yeah.
And as part of that grief, it is all the emotions, all of them. The ones we're taught that we shouldn't show publicly. And every now and then we'll have happy emotions and we'll feel guilty about that because we should feel sad. And it's all 100% normal. And being able to find somebody to share that with, whether it's a counselor, I agree with you completely, a professional who knows what they're talking about, brilliant. But even if it's somebody who has been through something similar or is a little bit further along the journey, whatever it might be, or just somebody you trust not to try and solve your problem, finding somebody to talk to, I think, it's hard to think of something more powerful or more helpful.
I agree. And I like the fact you said not someone solving it for you or trying to put, make you feel better. It's about the person that you can feel like they're holding space for you to be all of them, whatever it is at that time.
Yeah.
Because I found myself recently speaking to someone like, because it was so relatable, wanting to tell them my experience rather than go, I wanted them to know I understood what they were saying, but they didn't need to hear my, like things like even with like your relationship, like how our partners deal with it. Like that was them doing their best. But it was quite interesting to hear someone going through it, go, oh yeah, that's the same, and I wanted to, but actually, no, what you need is someone to go, I don't want to explain why I get it, but I get it.
I'm here, I'm in the mud with you, but I'm in it.
Yeah.
And
I think, okay. and I think I know we're going to wrap up, but also I think that we have moments of recognizing the fragility of this life in this lifetime, and it kind of is like sometimes a bit of a wake up call for those around or those who are experiencing it. And I think we can quickly lose that again as well, very quickly, especially if there's someone young. There's been quite a few people locally who've died recently who are younger than my husband, and all of a sudden everyone goes on like this health kick all of a sudden, and like, oh my god, I've got to look after myself. And like, it's all lessons. Like those people that have passed early are teaching us that don't take it for granted that you're going to wake up tomorrow morning, because you have no idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're digressing a little bit.
Yeah. So conscious of our time, it's been an amazing conversation. We covered, I think, what we wanted to.
Yeah, I agree.
Most of it.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, not really. I just, if this has resonated in any way, and it's triggered something, any emotions or whatever, like genuinely I am here, you know, like if you did feel comfortable to chat things through. And yeah, and I'm glad that we're having a conversation about it, because like I said, I think it's weirdly a taboo subject, that I don't know why. We said once before it could be cultural, but I don't think it's beneficial hiding away from such a huge life experience, like we said, that everybody gets to go through at some point.
Yeah, well said. So thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you very much, everybody, for listening. We love doing this, and we are keen to keep doing it and make it as useful as possible. So we would love to hear your thoughts. If you have any comments you'd like to give us, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We are handsupifyou'rehuman@gmail.com. Please send us an email. Please like, review, share our episodes with people you think might benefit from them. And we will be back in a couple of weeks. Actually, we're about to launch a new series of shorter podcasts, much shorter. But we will tell you a little bit more about that when it comes out next week.
Yeah, exciting.
Thank you very much, everybody. We'll speak to you soon.
See you later.